All right. So I know all of you at some point have heard the word selfishness used as an epithet. If you want to say something bad about a person, if you want to say how really rotten the person is, you say they're selfish. And that's considered to be totally incompatible with virtue. And a couple years ago, I came across what I thought was a very interesting example of this. It was a wave of articles. This is at the height of the pandemic in late 2020. And there was a spate of articles talking about how the pandemic can be blamed on selfishness. So one article called it a pandemic of selfishness. And they actually used the phrase, there is no I in mask. I didn't say it was a well-written article, but you get the idea. Paul Krugman, who can usually be counted upon to be completely wrong in this sort of thing, had a column which he says, I blame Ayn Rand for the pandemic. He says, because, quote, some people are enraged by any suggestion that they should bear some inconvenience to protect the common good. So the pandemic is Ayn Rand's fault because she was promoting self-interest and selfishness as opposed to sacrifice for the public good. Now, some of these claims are actually, on their own terms, are kind of incoherent. And that's summed up in another headline for one of these articles, which read, quote, selfish behavior is only going to prolong the pandemic, unquote. Now, on its own terms, think about that. In what way would it be selfish? In what way would it be in your self-interest to prolong the pandemic? Right, so these people are saying, now there's argument about which measures would work to shorten the pandemic or prolong it. But these people all believe that the things they were advocating were things that would be good for you, that they would shorten the pandemic, they would make it last less long, you'd be less likely to die, you'd be less likely to have disruption to the economy. And so we would all be better off, if you take it seriously, we would actually all be better off if they did what they're telling us to do. But then they had to go call it selfishness. And that's what I mean by it's used as an epithet, which is that it's used as a bad word that you throw at people without thinking seriously about what actually does this word mean. What does selfishness actually mean? What is actually in people's self-interest and how you define that? They don't do that thinking, they just use it as an epithet. And that implication kind of backfires in a way because if Ayn Rand observed once that if people grow up to believe that the quote here is, when people grow up to believe that moral laws bear no relation to the job of living except as an impediment and a threat, she says, they will come to believe that actual evils are the practical means of existence. If people believe that selfishness is evil, they will conclude that evil is selfish. Now, there's lots of examples today. I know some of you may have heard of a guy named Andrew Tate. He's a former martial artist who became this sort of star on YouTube by promoting this subversion of sort of hyper-masculinity and self-assertiveness. And he was also got in the news because he was just arrested in Romania, I think it is, for rape and human trafficking. So this is a guy who's selling himself as, I'm for self-assertiveness. He's an example of selfishness. And then the means by which he's doing that is basically he's a brute and a thug and a criminal. So he's someone who has grown up learning that selfishness is evil and has concluded, therefore, that evil is selfish. Now, this is what makes Ayn Rand's philosophy so unique and powerful. So Ayn Rand is known for advocating the virtue of selfishness, being an advocate of self-interest. But she was also an advocate of the selfishness of virtue, the idea that virtue is in your interest. Ayn Rand was not a hedonist. She argued that selfishness requires virtuous action. It requires self-discipline, long-range thinking, and principles. And what is more, she actually argued that only selfishness would require virtue, that virtue would actually be useless to someone who is not pursuing his own good. And that's what I want to explore today. The ways in which Ayn Rand redefined morality and self-interest, and also the way she redefined virtue. Now, I said Ayn Rand has a radical, it seems very radical that she advocated the virtue of selfishness, advocated for self-interest. But it's actually not, historically, it's not that completely radical. There's an earlier history she's drawing upon. And someone asked recently about what about the Founding Fathers and religion? Well, the Founding Fathers, American Founding Fathers came in an era in which self-interest was widely accepted as a moral philosophy. A philosophy of enlightened self-interest, or what they called self-interest properly understood. And quote, the guy I like to use to quote this is a guy named Jonathan Mayhew. He was a Boston preacher from about 1748 until his death in 1766. And he was hugely influential on people like John Adams, was one of the people who used to go to his sermons, and hugely influential on the founding generation. And he was also representative of the Enlightenment philosophy of the era, including the Enlightenment philosophy in religion. So in one of he did a series of sermons called the Seven Sermons, which were sort of his shot across the bows to the Puritan establishment in New England. And in those 7 sermons, here's one of the things he says about morality. I've got my little cheat sheet here to make sure I get this right. It being proposed that there is some particular course of method of acting which tends to promote our happiness upon the whole, and that a contrary conduct tends to our misery, which, by the way, are not bare suppositions but plain facts. A fitness of the former course of action in opposition to the latter necessarily follows. For happiness being itself a good and misery an evil, it is in itself right and reasonable to pursue the former and avoid the latter. He concludes, virtue then is what we are under obligation to practice without the consideration of the being of a God or of a future state after death, an afterlife, barely from the apparent tendency to make mankind happy at present. So his whole case for virtue is be virtuous because it will make you happy here in this world. And we don't even need God. We don't even need an afterlife. Now this is a guy, a Congregationalist minister preaching this from the pulpit in Boston in the 1750s. And you can find similar statements. I'm cutting some of these out for length, but similar statements like Adam Smith has in The Wealth of Nations. There's a section where he complains about how the moral philosophy of the Middle Ages was all based on how you could get into heaven, and they had no concern, and they actually thought that virtue was an impediment to happiness in this life. And he says, what we need to do is we need to focus on how virtue can lead to, as you put it, the most perfect happiness in this life. And that was in the Enlightenment, there was sort of a revolution in moral philosophy along those lines, where they said, we're going to get rid of the old medieval approach where it's about self-abnegation, it's about sacrifice, it's about getting into heaven. We're going to make it about achieving happiness here on this earth. Now, what happens after that, and if you go into Alexis de Tocqueville, you came to the United States in 1832, went around and observed America and comes back and reports on it. He reports similar things being said preached in the pulpits in America in the 1830s. And talks about how he says, the doctrine of self-interest properly understood is widely, universally accepted among Americans. They explain everything about their action with reference to self-interest properly understood. And he says, I even see them do things that are extremely generous or patriotic that Tocqueville thinks are acts of sacrifice. He says, I try to tell that to the Americans, and they insist it's not the truth. They insist that they're actually acting in their own long-term, properly understood self-interest. And he gets kind of exasperated by this, but I think the Americans were right. All right, so Ayn Rand is really returning to that older tradition of rational self-interest. So what happens is, this is a universally accepted thing in America in the 1830s. By the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, altruism comes to America. And the philosophy of altruism then becomes the dominant philosophy. Now altruism, and this is something that people don't think, altruism has sort of become used as a general catch-all term for being nice to people or being compassionate. Altruism in its original philosophical form was something way far out different from that. Altruism was a term that was actually invented in about 1830 by a French philosopher named Auguste Comte. And it meant otherism. Comte's, the big slogan of his morality was Vive pour autrui, which means to live for others. And it's the idea that the whole purpose of your life is simply to serve other people, and you should have no aspect of self-interest at all. You should be purely sacrificing everything for the collective good of others. And this comes to America and then becomes synonymous with morality. So this earlier tradition of self-interest properly understood is sort of lost. And Ayn Rand is coming along, 100 years, in the early 20th century. She's reviving that and hearkening back to it. But she's also putting it on a more consistent and more solid foundation. Now, the article I'm going to recommend to people as a way to really, I think, get the best understanding of this is, she has that article, The Objectivist Ethics, where she spells out her moral philosophy, but there's one that comes a little bit later. This is 1970. She wrote an article called Causality versus Duty. And this is sort of her returning to the foundations of ethics like 15 years after she first developed these ideas. I think she comes up with some very compelling and interesting and enlightening new formulations there. Now, causality versus duty is addressing the idea of a duty ethics, the idea that ethics comes from the idea that, well, there's certain things you just have to do. They're necessary. And why they're necessary is kind of, different theories. Some of them are religious theories that say, well, it's necessary because these are commandments from God, so it has a supernatural source. And others are a little more vague. But the idea is that there's something that is just absolutely necessary, a rule you must follow, and you must follow it because you must follow it. You'll notice a certain circularity there. So Ayn Rand rejects this idea. She says, well, actually, the only kind of necessity we could have for morality is what she calls, quote, realistic necessity, unquote. Now, what does realistic necessity mean? Well, let's see, the way she defines it is this. And this, I think, is the key passage. She says, reality confronts man with a great many musts, but all of them are conditional. The formula of realistic necessity, now remember that phrase, realistic necessity. The formula of realistic necessity is you must if. And if stands for man's choice. If you want to achieve a certain goal. So the examples she gives are, you must eat if you want to survive. You must work if you want to eat. You must think if you want to work. You must look at reality if you want to think, if you want to know what to do, if you want to know what goals to choose, if you want to know how to achieve them. So realistic necessity, notice that the formula for realistic necessity is about if you want to achieve a certain goal. So this is about a cause and effect relationship between your actions and a goal that you're achieving. It's about, she describes it later as being about final causation. Now, final causation is a terminology that comes from Aristotle, but it basically means the causal relationship between goals and ends. And it's also sometimes referred, and I'll use this word, as teleology. So telos is the Greek word for a goal. And so teleology is the study of the relationships between means and ends, between a goal and the actions that are needed to achieve it. And this is the foundation for her formula of realistic necessity. You pick a goal and then you have to do certain things. You have musts that you have to perform that are dictated by that causal relationship between the goal and the means to achieve it. So Ayn Rand says, this is in the same essay, in order to make the choices required to achieve his goals, a man needs the constant automatized awareness of the principle which duty has all but obliterated in his mind, the principle of causality, specifically of Aristotelian final causation, the process by which an end determines the means, the process of choosing a goal and taking the actions necessary to achieve it. In a rational ethics, it is causality, not duty, that serves as the guiding principle in considering, evaluating, and choosing one's actions, particularly those necessary to achieve a long-range goal. Now, the long-range goal is going to be important. Keep that in mind. So this is a very different approach to morality. Morality is not about duties. It's not about rules. It's about goals. It's about goals that you want to achieve and then enacting the things that are necessary to get to those goals. And the way that this sort of recasts the whole basis of morality, I think is really captured in this, I think, the most important section from this essay, Causality versus Duty. I'm going to pick this apart a little bit more, but here's the section. Quote, the disciple of causation faces life without inexplicable chains, unchosen burdens, impossible demands, or supernatural threats. His metaphysical attitude and guiding moral principle can best be summed up by an old Spanish proverb. And the proverb is, God said, take what you want and pay for it. But to know one's own desires, their meaning, and their costs requires the highest human virtue, rationality. All right, so there's a lot going on there. But first thing I want you to notice is that she is recasting the whole basis for morality. Morality doesn't begin with rules and restrictions. It begins with taking what you want. So this is a view of morality, in this view, is not a restriction on you. It is liberating and empowering. And this is how selfishness, self-interest is sort of she puts it into the very basis of morality. She says, in order to have musts, things that you must do in life, the only realistic must is, well, you have to do this if you want to achieve a certain goal. And that means that, morality is about pursuing goals. It's about taking what you want, getting what you want out of life. But the other side of that Spanish proverb is just as important. So the other side of the proverb is, and pay for it. Now, I mentioned I'm going to take a few things out of this section. So when she talks about She says, take what you want and pay for it. She also talks about knowing one's desires, their meaning, and their costs. So this discussion about payment and costs. So morality is about going out and getting what you want, but then there are payments and costs for it. And what she means by payment and costs is that there are these causal relationships. That paying the costs means enacting the necessary causes for what you want. All the necessary causes. You can't just say, oh, I want something and go grab it. You have to actually do the things that will bring that goal into existence. It can require work, it can require effort, it can require a long-range action. And then that ties into another really curious phrase in there, because she begins this by talking about the disciple of causation. And this is a phrase she uses a couple times in this article, talking about the person who really grasps the role of cause and effect in life is a disciple of causation. And the word disciple is really suggestive. Now, Ayn Rand, I think, wrote elsewhere, and this sort of a long-term cause of hers, it's in she did a 25th anniversary introduction to The Fountainhead. And in there she talks about how, she says that religion has taken over all these terms that we need. It has laid claim to all these terms that we need to refer to moral concepts and to spiritual concepts. So things like worship and reverence, they've all had these sort of religious connotations. And she's trying to take those words back from the religious context and put them into a secular context and give them a secular meaning. And so, when we see the word disciple show up here, that's where our ears should perk up, knowing that that's what she's trying to do. So she's trying to reclaim and give these religious terms a secular meaning. Now, disciple is an interesting one because it's very closely related to the word discipline. Right? So discipline. A discipline is the things that a disciple would do, the things that he's required, the rules he's required to follow, or the practices he's required to go through in order to be true to whatever creed it is he accepts. Now, discipline is a word that has some interesting shades of meaning, two different big kinds of meaning. So discipline can mean punishment, right? So you violated the rules, you have to be disciplined. A child has misbehaved, he's going to be disciplined. So you're going to be punished for something. And that's the more ascetic sort of, the Christian, Stephen was talking about Christian monks earlier. This is the Christian monk approach to discipline. But there's another sense in which we use discipline, which is think about an athlete training for an event, right? There's a great deal of discipline required to prepare for an athletic event. You have to do, you have to have a daily regimen of workouts. You have to, control what you eat. You have to do certain kinds of workouts. You have to do a lot of work, and you have to sustain it over a long period of time. So there's discipline in the sense of punishment, and there's discipline in the sense of training. Now, I am also, I'm an amateur pianist, a musician, and I understand that for musicians, there's also this concept of having to have a discipline, right? You have to go through the process of learning a new piece. You have to practice on a regular basis to maintain your skills, and they will degrade. A famous musician, I can't remember which one, famous violinist said, if I don't practice for one day, I notice. If I don't practice for 2 days, the critics notice, and if I don't practice for 3 days, the audience notices. So there's a discipline required to maintain the skills in order to be able to perform as a musician. And that's the sense. So this discipline in the sense of training is the way that Ayn Rand is using it here. And now the last word I want to pull out from this quote here. She says, so God said, takes what you want and pay for it, but to know one's own desires, their meaning, and their cost requires the highest human virtue, rationality. So virtue is now coming into this, and that's where virtue comes into this, which is that if you have to have a course of action you have to take that's required causally to reach your goals, and it's a course of action that requires discipline, it requires a long-term effort and sustained effort following certain rules and practices and guidelines, then that's what leads us to the idea of the importance of virtue. Now, this is a very unique concept of virtue. So I mentioned that it's based on the idea of the causal relationship between cause and effect, which is final causation or teleology. And hers is a teleological ethics and a teleological view of virtue. Now, teleology is the process of choosing a goal and taking the actions necessary to achieve it. And the virtues are a set of abstractions naming certain basic relationships between means and ends. So if you're trying to understand how do I choose, I'm choosing goals, how do I choose those goals, and how do I figure out the means to achieve them, you need to then have virtue. You need to have something that identifies what are the kinds of actions I need to take in order to, follow the causal requirements of achieving my goals. So virtues are a set of abstractions naming certain basic relationships between means and ends, between actions and goals. And this requires the fact, though, that the actions you're taking, this is not, like I said, this is not a hedonistic view. The actions you're taking are not short-term actions. It's not like hitting a guy over the head and taking his wallet. You don't need virtue for that, right? So what it assumes that the actions you're taking to achieve your goals, that you have big, ambitious goals, you have actions that require long-term action, they require self-discipline, and because of that, they require following certain guidelines, rules, principles. Now that's the sort of Ayn Rand's conception of virtue in general, and I'm going to get down to this, why you have specific virtues. Now the way she describes virtue, the pattern for it I want to set up here. So there's a section in Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged. So Atlas Shrugged, Galt's speech is the section where she goes out and basically spells out the philosophy behind the characters' actions of the novel. And in that she has this little section where she has a paragraph on each of the virtues. And the pattern for how she describes these virtues is set up in her first one, where she talks about the virtue of rationality. She says, rationality, this is the quote here, quote, rationality is the recognition of the fact that existence exists, that nothing can alter the truth, and nothing can take precedence over the act of perceiving it, which is thinking. So nothing takes precedence over thinking. But the important formulation there is, for our purposes today, is that rationality is the recognition of the fact that. And this is a repeated formula she uses in describing the virtues. Each one is a recognition of the fact that. So each one of these virtues is pointing you to some basic fact about human action, some basic fact about the relationship between your goals and the means necessary to achieve them, some basic fact that you need to keep in your awareness, you need to keep in mind and make as the basis for your action. So this, saying this Spanish proverb, take what you want and pay for it, that sort of becomes, you have to pursue goals, but at the same time you have to recognize facts. You have to recognize the facts about the means required to achieve those goals. Now, let's talk about the specific virtues that she gets to in setting this up. Now, Ayn Rand names 7 virtues. Rationality, independence, integrity, honesty, justice, productiveness, and pride. I have to write them down because there's 7 of them, and it's just a little more than I can, I get halfway through and I'm like, wait a minute, what have I covered and what haven't? So I had them written down. But I'm not going to go into, in detail on all of these virtues today. I'm going to give a brief discussion of each of them. The more important, because I don't have enough time to go over that, a whole other lecture would be required to go over all the virtues. But what I want to focus here is how Ayn Rand thinks about virtue, about what virtue is and the role it plays in life. And one of the things that really, this list, rationality, independence, integrity, honesty, justice, productiveness, pride. One of the things that struck me about this is how different this is, how new this is in the history of philosophy. Now, if any of you ever get the chance to go to Florence, Italy, and they have one of the great art galleries in the world, the Uffizi Gallery. So Florence was the birthplace of the Renaissance, and the Uffizi has probably the greatest collection of Renaissance art in the world. And one of the Renaissance artists is Sandro Botticelli. He's famous for the Venus, the Birth of Venus, the Venus on the half-shell painting, which is one, you probably, if you don't know it immediately from my talking about it, you probably recognize it if I showed it to you. And they have that in this giant room, and they have this, the painting is like 20 feet tall. They have this giant painting in this giant room of Venus on the half-shell. But in this little alcove, as you're entering that room, it's almost like a closet. They have this other little set of panel that I found even more interesting. The reason it's there is because it contains, like, 2 of the panels in here are the first 2 things that are known to have been painted by Botticelli. So that's the reason it's there. But I found it more interesting by what's being painted. So it's 7 paintings all sort of arranged in one panel, and they're allegorical figures representing virtues. So 7 paintings for 7 virtues. And what are the virtues? Well, the first 4 virtues represented there, are wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Now, temperance means like moderation of self-control of your emotions and appetites. So not eating too much, not drinking too much, not getting angry at people. So the virtues that are given are wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Anybody recognize those virtues? Where are they from? Hey, somebody in the back. Aristotle. Well, Aristotle, yes, but also the ancient Greeks in general. These were Aristotle uses them because these were widely accepted. If you went back 2,300 years and stopped the Athenian man on the street and said, what are the virtues? He would say wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. These are the standard classical era virtues, the virtues of the Greeks and Romans. Now, the other three, but that's 4 of the 7. The remaining 3 are faith, hope, and charity. Anybody recognize those? I hear church attendance is down these days, so I guess that must be the case. Anybody recognize them? They're the Christian virtues, faith, hope, and charity. So this gives you an idea of what the Renaissance, I found it fascinating because it gives you an idea of what the Renaissance is doing. They're saying, hey, we have this classical stuff that we've just rediscovered, but we also, Christianity is dominant, so let's see if we can mash these things together and combine them. So we'll have 7 virtues, 4 of them are classical, 3 of them are Christian, and we'll sort of somehow make that all work together. But the big thing is, notice what's missing. What's missing from this list of virtues, and basically from every list of virtues up to Ayn Rand, which is the virtue of productiveness. All these virtues are about thinking, and some of them are about courage. It's more about action in war, being willing to fight in a war. Temperance or charity are about how you use your wealth. None of them is about creating wealth. And it's really striking to me because, Florence at the time, so at the time of the Renaissance, Florence was this huge upsurge of productivity. So the guys who financed a lot of this were the Medicis, who were wool merchants who became bankers and financiers. And Florence at the time was growing rapidly. It was hugely productive. It was engaged in this vast network of trade. And they were also building buildings. One of the reasons why this touched off the Renaissance is they were building buildings that were built on totally new principles, totally innovative, that had things that hadn't been done before. So these were tremendously productive people engaging in innovation and trade and growth, and none of that shows up in their moral theory. And it doesn't show up for hundreds of years. It doesn't show up in their moral theory. And so that's why I want to focus a little bit first on the idea of productiveness as a central virtue in Ayn Rand's moral philosophy, because I think that's going to be extremely enlightening on this question of what is the role of virtue in her philosophy. All right, so what is productiveness? Now, Ayn Rand describes it as productive work is the process by which man's consciousness controls his existence. So I already quoted her talking about the importance of rationality. Right, so if the whole basis of morality is you're choosing goals and you're trying to find out the means that you need to enact, the causes you need to act in order to achieve them, then you need to use rationality. You need to know what's going on out in the world. What are these cause-effect relationships? What is true? What's out there? How do I? What is the nature of things? So you need to use rationality, but you don't need to just understand it intellectually. You need to act on it. You need to put that into action. And she says productiveness. Good to repeat this, is the productive work is the process by which man's consciousness controls his existence. So you take all this knowledge and you put it into action. I think if you think about this sort of teleological loop of you're choosing a goal and then you are enacting the means to achieve it, there's sort of 3 steps there. You have to think, you have to act, and then you have to enjoy the results, right? So those are the 3 steps. So you have to think and then you have to act. So thinking is rationality and action is productiveness. It's actually saying, okay, now that I understand what's going on, I can go out, I can build things, I can create things, I can build a cathedral on new principles that nobody's ever understood before. I can create networks of trade, I can create industry. And to think about productivity, let's go back even to the most primitive things. So like the first artifacts we have from human beings, the earliest artifacts we have, what are they? They're rocks where the edges of the rocks have been chipped away in certain ways. And they go back and they categorize this. They say, well, some of these we can tell are chipped away to be spearheads, for hunting. Some of them are chipped in a way to be scraping tools. Some of them are chipped away to be grinding or mashing tools. And so you go back, you find 50,000 years, 70,000 years ago, we find these odd-looking rocks that have been chipped away. That's the first evidence of productiveness as a human activity. of somebody sitting around. There's probably some guy. You can guess that every young man would have been trained, and maybe there's some guy who is really good at doing this, and he'd be a specialist, and he'd be making these tools that they can use. So that's the first evidence we have of human productiveness, and it's also one of the first evidences we have of human existence, of human activity in the world. And then later on, you have agriculture. And the invention of agriculture, vastly increases human population and increases the stability and security of human life. But agriculture is ultimate example of productivity in the fact that it requires a much longer range of action than even the chipping the flakes off of the rocks to make tools. You have to plant a crop. You have to then tend to it and protect it and wait months for it to produce its harvest. And then when you get the harvest, you have to store the harvest so you have it throughout the winter so you don't starve to death. So it's this idea of this long-term action that requires that kind of self-discipline. It requires an understanding of the law of cause and effect. And then, of course, we reach the state that we have in modern society, where you have the Industrial Revolution and everything takes off, and you're able to go beyond agriculture to saying, oh, we can produce all sorts of things in giant quantities. But notice the Industrial Revolution, what does it require? Well, it requires a steam engine. Right? This is a really complex, scientifically advanced. A whole science of thermodynamics sort of comes into existence in order to help people understand how to build steam engines. It's interesting that all the early advances in thermodynamics are done by people who are their day job is building steam engines, and they're trying to understand, how do I build a better steam engine? So they have to understand the whole science. So you see again the long-term action, the need to understand causes and consequences, and to have this self-discipline of applying yourself to a subject over a long period of time. So you see how productiveness is so central to the idea of what is human virtue and to Ayn Rand's unique view of human virtue. Because productiveness is the thing that requires you, in pursuing your goals, to engage in long-term action that requires self-discipline and the understanding and following of rules and principles. Now, so that helps us to sort of, I think, by looking at productiveness first, it allows us to understand Ayn Rand's view of the other specific virtues. So, the three of the virtues, I think, are more intellectual in character. They're more about how do you think. So rationality, she described it as the recognition of the fact that nothing can take precedence over the act of thinking. Independence is the idea that, as she put it, that no substitute can do your thinking. And integrity is the idea you cannot fake your consciousness. You can't say, I'm the sort of person who's going to do, you can't say, I have certain goals and I'm going to pursue those goals and take the actions and then do something else. You have to be the person you say you are. So this is, these are about the nature of, these virtues are primarily about the nature of thinking. Rationality says you have to think, independence says you have to think for yourself, and integrity says you have to think honestly about yourself, about who you are and what you're doing, and what you stand for. Now, productiveness is part of a group of virtues that I consider sort of more action-oriented. So there's productiveness, and there's also honesty and justice. And I want to talk about honesty and justice because I think honesty and justice are important, because when people think of somebody being a virtuous person, somebody being moral, somebody being trustworthy, somebody being the sort of person I'd like to, that we ought to have in the world, they probably, in sort of ordinary usage, they probably think of honesty and justice as being those central things. Somebody who's not going to lie to you, somebody who's not going to steal, somebody who's not going to do some sort of injustice to you, somebody's not going to treat you badly. So let's see how honesty and justice relate, are transformed, or are best understood in light of the central importance of productiveness in Ayn Rand's philosophy, and how that makes them selfish virtues. So she describes honesty as the recognition of the fact that you can't be, she has long descriptions, I'm just taking one little section to talk about. Honesty is the idea that you should not be dependent on the stupidity of others. As this is the idea that, if you're out there deceiving people, if you're telling them lies, if you're depriving them of accurate information about the world, you are depending on them to then go out acting on something that's not true. You're depending on their stupidity, on their lack of knowledge that you have actively deprived them of, prevented them from getting. Now, consider that if your goal is productive activity, if your goal is to go out and create new things and build new things and discover new principles and new innovations, why would you want to deprive people of information about the world? It would be self-destructive to deceive people, to have them out there acting on the basis, without the basis of knowledge that they need in order to act. So, Jay, if you're running your business, if you go lie to your employees, they're going to go off and do completely wrong things that will actually be worse for your business because you have deprived them of the information that they need in order to act. Similarly with justice, she says, justice is the recognition of the fact that every man must be judged for what he is and treated accordingly. Now, one of the ways in which you judge what people are, what a person is, what kind of person he is, and treat him accordingly, is judging, is this somebody who's being rational, somebody who's being productive, somebody who's thinking clearly, somebody who is engaged in constructive action. And again, if you're building a business, if you're trying to build a cathedral, if you're trying to forge a new trade route, if you're trying to build a steam engine, all these productive things that are the things that we do in order to improve and enhance human life, if you're doing those things, you want to make sure I'm working with somebody, I'm cooperating with people who are doing their level best to actually push this forward and advance this project, and not with people who are going to undermine it. That's why you need to judge other people's character, and that's why you need to reward the people who are the good people, and disassociate yourself or judge harshly the people who are destructive or malicious. So you see these virtues that are considered, if you ask the normal person, average person, what are the things I want? I want somebody who is just and who is honest. These are things that are selfish if you assume that the goal is productiveness, productive work, the creation of new things and new goods and new values in the world. And in turn, you would have the virtue of productiveness be central if you view morality the way Ayn Rand does, as being about the pursuit of goals, and especially of long-term goals. It's about deciding what your goals are and enacting the means to achieve them. Now, one thing I also want to notice is that Ayn Rand doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the virtues in her nonfiction. It's actually very interesting. She has these 7 paragraphs, roughly 7 to 10 paragraphs, where she talks about the virtues in Galt's speech. She doesn't spend a lot of time going back and talking about what the virtues are in her nonfiction. She spends a lot of time focusing on this implicitly in her fiction. And that's the other thing that's really striking and unique about Ayn Rand, is that in her fiction, who does she show us as her heroes? People who are engaged in productive activity. So her, in The Fountainhead, it's all about a visionary architect who has new ideas for how you can build, and especially ways to use new materials and new methods of construction. So that's her hero. You have, of course, in Atlas Shrugged, even more so, all the heroes are businessmen. There's like a guy who invents a new alloy of steel that's better than every previous version of metal ever invented. You have a woman who's running a railroad. You have a physicist developing a new theory of power, how to generate power, a new engine, etc. So, I just sort of describe Atlas Shrugged as capitalism's epic. So if it's sort of like she takes all the sort of grand scale and the epic action and the heroism of something like the Iliad and the Odyssey. But in the Iliad and the Odyssey, what do Homer's heroes do? They go around fighting people. They go around throwing spears at each other. And it gets actually quite the Iliad is actually quite gory in that regard sometimes. Whereas what she shows is, instead of the people going out and fighting, I'm going to have all that epic scale action, all the heroism, all the sort of the great stature of the characters, but it's all going to be about how can we go build something, how can we create something, how can we build a bridge, how can we make a new metal alloy, how can we build a skyscraper. So she's taking that heroism and that idea of human virtue, human excellence. The Greeks had a concept of virtue, right? And in the very early Greeks, in Homer, their concept of virtue is, somebody like Achilles, who's strong and powerful and can fight and wield a spear. And Ayn Rand says, let's take that and let's take our paragon of virtue is the people who are building and creating and innovating. Now, I also want you to notice, because we're at the Atlas Society here, one of the things that we like to focus on is the virtue of benevolence. So Ayn Rand has 7 major virtues, but there's all sorts of other ones. You have the virtue of selfishness, the virtue of courage, she mentioned several points, and we think benevolence is a virtue. That being goodwill towards your fellow man and treating your fellow man well is a virtue. But notice the benevolence that's built into this idea of virtue as being based on productiveness and being based on creation of values and creation of new innovations. And notice this is really summed up in Atlas Shrugged in Galt's Gulch, where you have this community of people who are selected as being producers and creators. And there's this tremendous benevolence because they are not working against each other. They're not fighting each other. They're not hurling spears at each other. They're all working together to build and create. And there's this whole discussion of how every new idea, every new creation, invention somebody comes up with increases everybody else's productivity, and they're all sort of in this race to the top to do new and better and greater things by working together. And that benevolence is built into this idea of productiveness as a central virtue. Now, there's one virtue I left off here, which or haven't gotten to yet, which is the virtue of pride. Now, I mentioned, if you're taking action to achieve your goals, you have to think, you have to act, and then you have to enjoy the reward. And pride is partly about enjoying the reward, saying, hey, I did this. I did the thinking, I got the ideas right, I took the actions were successful, I'm enjoying the pride at the result that I have created this thing. But pride, as Ayn Rand describes it, it goes beyond that. It goes to the idea of wanting to not just enjoying one specific action, but wanting to be the kind of person, wanting to reshape your character so that you are the kind of person who has the virtues necessary to take successful action, to pursue your goals and achieve your goals. And so it's not just about enjoying the goal, it's also about wanting the best in all things, and therefore wanting to reshape your own character. So it's the virtue of wanting virtue, is the way I would describe it. And that really sums up the approach she has towards virtue, is that the most selfish thing in the world is to want virtue, because when you want to be a virtuous person, it means you are wanting to have the best in all things, and that's how she describes it. It's about wanting to have the best in all things. It's about wanting to have the habits and the discipline to be able to go out and to take what you want and pay for it, to choose your goals and enact the means necessary to achieve them. Now, she also points out, and this is also in the essay Causality versus Duty, she said that only the selfish person could be virtuous. So she has a section about that where she, I pointed out earlier the sort of the paradox or the contradiction in people saying, using selfishness as a term to refer to something that they themselves think is against your interests. So, the person who says that selfishness is self-sacrifice is in a way actually an enemy of virtue, because he's basically telling people you have a self-interest in ignoring morality. Your self-interest as a self-interested, if you have any concern for your own well-being as self-interest, you should completely ignore everything I say about virtue, because that's what the implication is if you think virtue is self-sacrifice. But Ayn Rand goes a step further. She says, if one accepts duty in the name of morality, the infernal irony is that duty destroys morality. A duty-centered theory of ethics confines moral principles to a list of prescribed duties and leaves the rest of man's life without any moral guidance, cutting morality off from any application to the actual problems and concerns of man's existence. Such matters as work, career, ambition, love, friendship, pleasure, happiness are regarded by these theories as amoral, outside the province of morality. If so, then by what standard is man to make his daily choices or direct the course of his life? So there she's pointing out that the very fact that you need to pursue all these goals in life is the reason why you need virtue, and if virtue doesn't have to do with those goals, then you wouldn't need it in the overwhelming majority of your life. Now, the good news is most people do not actually listen to either side on this. That is, they don't actively, in the way they actually live their lives, they are not following the people who say you should sacrifice everything and never pursue your self-interest. And they're also, for the most part, not following the people who say, your self-interest involves being, being a thug and a brute and ignoring virtue and morality. Most people live by an implicit creed. That's a legacy of Jonathan Mayhew from the founding, or Adam Smith, or Tocqueville. These people who, most people, would think about what they do in their actual daily details of their life. They go to school, then they go get a job, and they work, and they are productive, and they buy a house, and they have a family, and they live orderly, decent lives in order to pursue their goals. So most people are actually living by that implicitly. But the problem is they're doing it implicitly. They're doing it without a clear, an explicit understanding of it, and a clear and explicit defense of it. And the results can be confusion, and they can be guilt. And inconsistency in pursuing them. So what they need to know is that selfishness is a virtue, and that virtue is selfish, and that's what Ayn Rand's ethics provides for them. All right, questions?
All right, everybody.
I think I only went 2 minutes over, which is a minor miracle.
All right, if we want to line up. If we want to line up behind Claire and myself, we'll start Q&A. Oh, there we go.
Is my mic still going? Okay, good.
A very important question. Who is John Galt? And the second question is existential question. What would Ayn Rand now have thought of Elon Musk?
Okay, good questions. Okay, so first the question, who is John Galt? Ayn Rand gives us the answer. Anybody know what the answer is that she gives in the Atlas Shrugged? Who is John Galt? Because Dagny Taggart asked the question. And she said, who is John Galt? And what does she say? She says, we are. And what she means by that, now this is in the context of the first run of the John Galt line. So she's basically, John Galt means, who is John Galt? And the novel means, who can achieve the impossible? And she says, here we are, this is the first run of the John Galt line, we have achieved the impossible. And so we, the productive people who have done this, are John Galt. But I think that applies more generally to, everyone is John Galt, to the extent that you are thinking, you're a rational thinker who is going out and being productive and achieving goals in the world. So that's sort of that's the message I take of who is John Galt, is we are John Galt. We, each of us, have that potential within us. The question of what would she have thought of Elon Musk? And I think that's interesting. I have no idea what she would, well, actually I do. Elon Musk strikes me as more of a character from the Fountainhead than Atlas Shrugged. Because in Atlas Shrugged, if you have somebody who has actually built a business, has started a business, and been very successful in business, that person is likely to be one of the, a fairly consistent good guy, right? He's consistently rational. He's consistently accepts something close to the objectivist philosophy, at least implicitly. In The Fountainhead, she does much more, providing us a mixed character. Elon Musk reminds me in some ways of Gail Wynand, right? Somebody who's very productive in some aspects of life, and then totally obsessed with fame and with gauging in little, what is he trying to do? He's doing a cage match with Mark Zuckerberg or something like that. I mean, that's out of The Fountainhead. That's absolutely 100% a Gail Wynand kind of thing. So I'll refer you to a piece I wrote a little while back called Who is Elon Musk? And it's definitely based on who is John Galt, who is Elon Musk? Or I talk about him as being, I describe him as an Ayn Rand hero rewritten by Tom Wolfe. So if you know Tom Wolfe's work, you get the idea that Tom Wolfe had the idea of this America as a carnival where all these crazy things are going on, and he was trying to capture the craziness of American society. And that's sort of, and also his characters in Tom Wolfe's novels are all very obsessed with status and what other people think of them, and with fame and how they appear to others. And that's how I view Elon Musk, because he's this mixed character.
Rob, thank you. I have a question about the ethical theories. You mentioned teleology and goal-directed approach to ethics, by contrast with duty ethics.
Yeah.
And that's a distinction drawn in academic philosophy, more broadly. But the teleological ethic has another division between the most well-known example of the teleological ethic is utilitarianism. You act for the greatest good of the greatest number. And that is a goal direction. And it defines its virtues by reference to that ultimate end. But that is not the same end as Rand's. I mean, that is a collectivist ethic.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you would comment on that, whether anything that you said against the duty ethic would apply to utilitarianism or its sister brother collectivist kin.
Well, utilitarianism is also a different thing because that's part of the So the thing I had to cut for length, and I may not even be able to do in a Q&A, is there's this view of there's duty ethics, there's a consequentialist ethics, which is it's all about what are the consequences, and it doesn't really matter what you do so long as it ends up right, as long as you get the right result. And then there's a virtue ethics, which I think is kind of defined in a very circular way. It's like, well, you do what the virtuous person would do. Well, what would the virtuous person do? Well, he'd do what's good. It's like, well, okay, the good is what the virtuous person would do, and virtuous person does what's good. It's a circular, non-definition. But so I think teleology is different for that. Now, as to the collectivist teleology, you do something for the greatest good of the greatest number. First, I'm going to point out that mostly when you get to the collectivists or these utilitarian versions of it, what you don't have is a teleological ethics. What you have is a consequentialist ethics, which is it doesn't really matter what you do so long as the result is right. Teleological ethics is different from that because, put it this way, if I were to shoot you right now, and I get mad at you and I shoot you, and let's say they cart you off in the hospital, and then you're being operated at the hospital, and the doctor discovers, oh, you actually have a rare form of cancer that I wouldn't have discovered if I hadn't operated on you because you were shot. And so not only you're cured from the gunshot that I inflicted on you, but you then get cured from a cancer that might have killed you. So the result is, hey, you're better off, right? So I was acting as your benefactor by shooting you. Now, obviously, I was not acting as your benefactor. So teleology means it's the relationship between means and ends that is important. So it's not just what I intended. If I intend to get the right result and I fail, a lot of socialists have said, oh, we had the best intentions. It's like, well, but if you didn't think through the intentions. But it's not just the results, it's that relationship between means and ends, between picking a goal and then enacting the means to achieve them. If I try to do you harm and actually end up doing you good, that doesn't, that's not the same thing as a teleological thing. Now, the other thing about the collectivist view of teleology, so most of the teleological views are the consequentialist, where I just once summed up consequentialism as you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, which is sort of the excuse used by most totalitarian regimes, and especially communist regimes, for the fact that, oh, well, we killed a lot of people. By breaking a few eggs, they mean skulls. We killed a whole bunch of people, but we were going towards the future paradise. Now, the last thing about the teleological ethics is teleology has to be real teleology. It has to be a teleology based in reality. And in reality, is there a collective entity that experiences the end result of its goals? Right? Is there a public or a common good that exists as a real thing? And the answer is no, because there is no such thing as a collective. There is no collective superorganism that experiences the results of action. There is only individuals, only a collection of individuals. Only individuals can experience the benefits of action, so only they can actually have goals. A collective does not have goals and cannot benefit from goals because it's not a thing. It's just a collection of individuals. It's only the individual that has real goals. So they have a sort of a pseudo-teleology of we're going to pretend that there's such a thing as a collective and that it has such a thing as a good, and then we're going to pursue that. But it's a pretense. It's not something that is real. The next question. Question down there again.
Rob, how important is it to talk about ethics or virtues in the context of values? Can you actually talk about, is it possible to talk about virtues without reference to values? And I'm thinking specifically of people who advocate virtue ethics and don't seem to ground them the way Rand would in causality the way you do.
Yeah.
And the other point the other factum is Marxists would talk about productivity and extol the virtues of productivity, but in a very different way than we would.
Yeah, it's interesting though. So talking about Marxists and productivity. So I'm working right now on a pocket guide to socialism, and so I've been doing a lot of research in this and going into their attitudes. And one of the things in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels had this paragraph that's kind of a famous paragraph where they talk about all the amazing achievements of the Industrial Revolution. It's this whole population's conjured out of the ground, machinery and canals and all these amazing things that have been done. But they talk about these amazing things that have been done in this very passive sense. These things, machinery has been extended. Well, it's a very passive, like who was actually doing this thing? This thing didn't just happen, somebody did it. And then they all say, who would have imagined that all this productivity slumbered in the lap of social labor? So again, their theory is all this productivity doesn't come from individual people doing things. It comes from social collective action. It comes from the collective action of the guys, turning knobs or twisting wrenches on the assembly line. And so that's part of the problem. Again, we talk about this imagined teleology of the greatest good for the greatest number, that you're imagining that there's a collective entity that is that has and you're imagining that it has such a thing as its own good, and that you're going to achieve that. But it's an abstraction. It's an imagined abstraction. It doesn't correspond to something in reality. The Marxists loved productivity, but they thought they had a view of that it's an imagined causality. Productivity is caused, all this great productive effort of the Industrial Revolution is caused by society as a whole and not by individuals. And so, like James Watt doesn't appear in the Communist Manifesto, or a guy who was around at the time, one of my favorite guys, Isambard Brunel, who was like, he did all sorts of refinements of the steam engine. He designed bridges. He was a super engineer of the early 19th century Britain. He created the first transatlantic steamship line. So it's this giant of productive effort. A guy like that doesn't exist in the Marxist viewpoint. So what they want is they want to have this sort of imagined cause of productivity is society as a whole acting somehow. And they're very vague about it. And they want to ignore the actual reality of productivity. So I don't know if that answers that question. And as the values of virtue ethics is really getting into the weeds philosophically. So we can have a discussion about that, but maybe later on.
Okay, final quick question over here.
I'm interested in discussing one topic that usually comes up when debating altruism versus self-interest, and is charity and philanthropy. And my question is, how does objectivism view acts of charity and philanthropy, and are these actions compatible with the philosophy's emphasis on self-interest?
Oh, good question. So how does the philosophy view charity? All right, so there's a difference between charity or benevolence and sacrifice, right? So if I let's say I buy you a cup of coffee because I like you, right? I'm doing something good for you. The cost to me is relatively minimal. It's not a sacrifice. A cup of coffee doesn't cost that much. Actually, I can just go get you one for free out here and then pretend that I did it. But let's say we go to Starbucks and pay too much for a cup of coffee. But I'm doing that because I want to have a conversation with you and I like you. So I've done something that's active benevolence towards you. But it's something that's done without necessarily being a sacrifice to me, because I'm doing it, first of all, I'm doing it in response to the fact there's something about you that I like, that I think is worthy of having this help. And also because it's something that is not going to fundamentally undercut my most important values. Right, so that would be totally, and actually there's when they had Ayn Rand's letters, her personal letters, that she had a stash of the store of these, when they were released, one of them was of her writing to, I think, a nephew or a niece of hers. And included in the letter was a little cash to help them for I think it was Thanksgiving was coming up, and they were having guests over. Says, don't worry about the money. Here's $20, which at that time was an actual real amount of money. Here's $20 to help you with the expenses. So she herself engaged in acts of charity or benevolence. So the point is that if it's somebody who deserves it and it's something that is not a sacrifice to you, then it's not only acceptable, it can actually be mandatory. I mean, how much would if a friend of yours, a good friend of yours, there's a great example. We're talking about the consequential ethics. It's a great example of somebody saying, what if I visit my friend, a friend of mine is sick and he's in the hospital and I go visit him. And at the end he says, well, thanks for visiting me, it really helped. And what would you say in return? Would you say, well, I didn't really want to come see you, but I figured I had a duty to do it. That's the duty-centered theory of ethics. Somebody would think, well, that's the altruistic approach to ethics. If you actually said, oh, I didn't want to see it, it's been painful, it's been a sacrifice, I've hated every minute of it, but I really did it for your sake. The person would strike you off of their list of friends, and the nurses would look at you funny, and everybody would think you're crazy. The only real answer to that question is, if a friend of yours is in the hospital and you go visit him to help cheer him up and help him out, the only answer to when he thanks you is to say, well, I wanted to do it because you're important to me. Right? So that is a self-interested motive for charity and benevolence. Now, the other aspect of this that Ayn Rand makes a big point of is also saying most of life is not lived in the hospital. right? So most of human life, if we look at, especially, the insanity of this for me is that we live, when people talk about the welfare state. So I did an interview with Steven Pinker a while back, and he's defending the welfare state, and he immediately refers to the little match girl, which is this story by Hans Christian Andersen about this girl like freezing to death at midnight on on Christmas Eve on the streets of Oslo or something like that, because her father has turned her out of doors, her abusive father has turned her out of doors to sell matches in the streets. It's this horribly grim story that's supposed to be heartwarming. And it comes from this context of the early 19th century when the vast majority of people were desperately poor. And the idea of, a 6-year-old girl, inadequately clothed out on the streets on a freezing night would not have been considered totally unrealistic. Right? But the absurdity of this is Steven Pinker in the 21st century in America talking about the little match girl. He's in the wealthiest society in all of human history. Acting as if the fundamental reality of life is that we're all poor and on the brink of starvation, right? So that's the other thing that Ayn Rand says, is that the essential of life is not we're all in a hospital and we need help and we're hanging I think she's hanging by our fingernails on the edge of a cliff. The reality of life, of the normal human life, is we're out being productive and pursuing goals and achieving these amazing things, and help and charity and the people needing aid and assistance from elsewhere it's a minority situation. It's a small exception to the normal rule of going out and engaging in teleological action, pursuing your goals. So that's the full answer.
All right, everybody give Rob a big round of applause.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rob, very much. That was wonderful.